She doesn't run anything. Let her eat with the staff. That was what my brother's new wife said loud enough for the entire table to hear. I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I calculated. My mother said nothing. My father looked away. Even my brother, the man whose wedding I came to support, didn't speak up. That silence. It spoke louder than any insult. They thought I was nothing but the girl who used to fetch coffee in board meetings. They thought I was here as decoration, as obligation, not as the woman who built the very company they were about to merge with, the one holding the final signature on the $30 million deal they desperately needed. So I smiled. I pulled out my phone, and with 3 words, cancel the contract. I shattered their carefully crafted future. My brother froze. My mother turned pale. The bride stopped breathing. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I didn't scream. I simply walked out and took their empire with me. If you think that was the climax, oh, we're just getting started. Stay with me, because what happened after that moment, let's just say. Karma came wearing heels and carried receipts. I arrived at my brother's wedding 15 minutes early, not out of excitement, but out of respect. That I had always given respect even when it wasn't returned. My heels clicked softly across the marble floor of the grand ballroom, echoing in a room where every face was turned away from me. No one noticed. No one waved. I wasn't surprised. That's how it had always been in this family, Olivia present, but not acknowledged. The decor was exquisite. White orchids suspended from gold archways, candles floating in crystal bowls. It was all meticulously curated. Everything screamed elegance, wealth, control. Exactly the way Jason and his new wife Madison wanted it. Controlled. Picture perfect. And for some reason, despite everything I knew, I still held out a thin thread of hope that this day might be different. I walked toward the front of the room, searching for my name among the table cards. I passed my aunt, who glanced up, then quickly turned back to her conversation. My cousin offered me a tight-lipped smile and returned to her wine. It wasn't hostility. It was indifference. That somehow was worse. Then I saw the seating chart. Large, elegant, hand-calligraphed, names neatly listed under table numbers. Jason and Madison sat at table 1, of course. My parents at table 2. The bridal party at table 3. Family friends, old neighbors, former teachers. Everyone had their place. Except me. I scanned the chart again. My name was nowhere to be found. A wedding planner hovered nearby, holding a clipboard and a practiced smile. I approached her, trying to maintain composure. "Excuse me, I think there might be a mistake. I don't see my name on the chart." She glanced down at her list, frowned slightly, and then smiled too quickly. "Oh yes, Miss Olivia. Table 14. Table 14, I repeated. "It's toward the back near the kitchen," she said. "There were some late changes." I nodded once, keeping my expression neutral. I didn't argue, didn't ask who made the change. I already knew. I turned toward the back of the ballroom. Table 14 sat next to the swinging kitchen doors. The smell of roasted lamb and garlic wafted through the air as servers bustled in and out. The tablecloth was slightly wrinkled, the silverware mismatched. 2 catering staff sat at the table on break, laughing softly. One looked up as I approached and quickly stood embarrassed. Before I could respond, I heard it. Clear, cold, and calculated. "She doesn't run anything. Let her eat with the staff." Madison's voice rang out like a bell. Smooth, icy, practiced. She didn't shout it. She didn't need to. The volume was intentional, loud enough for several heads to turn. I turned slowly. She was standing beside Jason, her arm linked through his. A group of their friends surrounded them, all dressed in polished perfection. My mother stood not far off, pretending to adjust the ribbon on a flower arrangement. My father looked toward the dance floor, hands in his pockets. Jason saw me. Our eyes met for a moment. Then he looked away. That moment, that one shared glance, it confirmed everything. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't oversight. It was deliberate. They didn't see me as family. They saw me as a threat, a liability, and perhaps most insulting of all, a disposable accessory to their perfect public image. I felt the sting rise behind my eyes, but I didn't let it show. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Instead, I smiled. It wasn't forced. It was real, cold, sharp, and absolutely certain. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. No trembling fingers, no hesitation. Just muscle memory and conviction. I dialed one number. It rang once. Yes. Cancel the contract. I said, calm and crystal clear. Silence. Then a clipped reply. Understood. I hung up. Behind me, the wedding planner blinked. A server dropped a spoon. Something in the room shifted. No one knew why yet. But they would. I walked back through the room, not rushing, not slowing. Every step felt heavier, more real, more deliberate than the one before. Jason watched me pass. His mouth opened, but no sound came. My mother turned, reaching out half-heartedly. My father narrowed his eyes, sensing something but too proud to ask. Madison stood frozen, her champagne flute trembling slightly. They didn't yet realize that the $30 million contract they'd built this wedding around was gone. That I had just pulled the final string holding their fragile house of cards together. But soon they would. Because I wasn't just Olivia, the girl at the edge of every family photo. I was the executive they never credited, the strategist they always underestimated. And now I was the woman who had just walked out with their future. I exited the ballroom, heels silent against the rug, breath even back straight. Let them eat their cake. I had bigger things to build. I didn't cry as I walked out of the ballroom. I didn't let myself feel anything just yet. There would be time for that later. For now, all I could think about was how predictable it had all been. The insult, the silence, the betrayal. None of it surprised me. Not really. It had always been like this. Long before the contract, long before the wedding, long before Madison ever entered our lives. When I was 8, I remember being called the quiet one by every adult in the room. Not because I was shy, but because I had learned early on that my words didn't carry weight. My brother Jason, 2 years older, was the loud one, the golden boy. The kind of child that walked into a room and sucked up all the air without even meaning to. He had that kind of presence that made people lean in, listen, admire. I had curiosity books and a habit of doing things right the first time, but no one seemed to notice quiet competence when loud charm was in the room. At school, I brought home straight A's. Science fairs, writing contests, debate team. My trophies filled a box under my bed. My parents never made it to a single award ceremony. Jason once got a C+ in algebra, and my mother hired a tutor the next day. I remember asking for help with my college applications. My father waved a hand and said, "You'll figure it out. You always do." Jason, meanwhile, had 3 sets of eyes reviewing his essays and a private counselor to prep for his interview. It wasn't that they didn't love me. I don't think they meant to be cruel. But in our house, love was measured in attention, and Jason always got the spotlight. I learned how to thrive in the shadows. I didn't ask for much. I didn't rebel. I didn't challenge the system. I just worked. Quietly. Consistently. Invisibly. When our father started Atlas, he brought Jason in on day 1. Jason was given a desk, a title, and a stack of business cards with his name in bold letters. I was in college then, juggling classes and part-time jobs. I offered to help with accounting, software, operational flow, even investor pitches. My father said, "We'll call you when we need you." They didn't. Not for years. Then the market crashed and Atlas nearly folded. Jason panicked. Our father had passed by then, and Jason had no idea how to keep the company afloat. That was the first time he called me not as a sister, but as a last resort. I stepped in. Quietly. I streamlined operations, consolidated vendors, rewrote the financial model. I made it work. No headlines, no title, no applause. When the company stabilized, Jason went on television and said, "We adapted." I made hard decisions. I wasn't even mentioned. He didn't need to say my name to benefit from my labor. He never had. At home, it was no different. If Jason missed curfew, I got the lecture. If he forgot to lock up after a party, I was told to be more responsible. One Thanksgiving, he drove drunk and wrecked a neighbor's fence. My mother cried, my father raged, and then they both turned to me and asked how I could let it happen. I was at college, 3 hours away. They saw me as the one who cleaned up the mess, who made things smooth again. And once the mess was gone, so was I. Forgotten, unacknowledged, expected to disappear until needed again. Even at family dinners, the pattern held. Jason arrived late, told the same stories, repeated the same half-truths, and was rewarded with laughter and praise. I tried once to bring up an idea I had for a non-profit incubator. My mother changed the subject mid-sentence. My father passed the salt. Jason cut me off with a joke about my old car and everyone laughed. That was when I stopped speaking up. Not out of bitterness, but out of understanding. Some tables weren't set for you. You were just expected to serve quietly and move on. I used to wonder what it was about me that made them act that way. Was I too serious? Too quiet? Not charming enough? But the truth is, it had nothing to do with flaws. It had to do with roles. They had assigned them early, and no one ever thought to question them. Jason was the future. I was the fallback. He was the face. I was the insurance plan. He was the empire. I was the hands holding the foundation together. As I stood on the sidewalk outside the hotel that night, watching guests arrive in black tie attire with glasses of champagne and perfect hair, I realized that they had never seen me clearly. Not once. They saw the shape of me, but not the substance. They used my skills, but never gave them a name. They asked for my loyalty, but never offered it in return. I was always the one in the room who understood what needed to be done but was never asked to speak. The one who read contracts while others toasted to their own brilliance. The one who said yes out of duty, never out of recognition. The one who built quietly so others could take the credit. But that was over now. The day I realized they were building their legacy on my silence was the day I stopped believing recognition would ever come. After everything I had done, every late night, every number crunched, every meeting saved, at the last second they still saw Jason as the hero. And they always would. After my father died, I thought there might finally be a shift. Maybe grief would clear their vision. Maybe they'd remember who held Atlas together when Jason was fumbling, when the numbers didn't add up, when even the board was ready to abandon ship. I thought loss would bring clarity. But instead, it brought erasure. My father's will named Jason as CEO without question. I wasn't offered a role, not even interim leadership. Instead, I was told the board felt continuity was important. Translation. Jason was a familiar face, and I was a woman in the background. I nodded through the announcement, shook hands, accepted the polite smiles and empty praise. "You've done so much behind the scenes," they said. "Your insights were invaluable." But insights weren't ownership. Strategy wasn't credit. And silence wasn't consent. It started months before my father's passing, when Atlas teetered on the edge of insolvency. I got a frantic call from Jason. "We need help," he admitted, not even trying to sound composed. When I arrived, the office felt like a ghost ship. Empty cubicles, tense assistants, half the executive team gone, vendors unpaid. I asked him for the truth. "How bad?" He said, "We're 30 days from collapse." That was generous. It was more like 15. I didn't waste time. I pulled together emergency audits, cleaned up reporting trails, discovered duplicate vendors, bleeding money, and reached out to 3 key investors I had built quiet relationships with over the years. I was the one who convinced them Atlas had a future. Jason didn't know the language of numbers, but I did. I made the case, I laid out the plan, and I promised them results. They trusted me, not the face of the company, but the mind behind it. They signed. $17 million in new investment came through within 3 weeks. Payroll was saved. Operations resumed. Confidence returned. Jason went back to smiling in boardrooms and answering interviews. I went back to my corner office. No press, no profile. Just the same titleless position I'd always had, advisor, contributor, fixer. The first article came out in a major business magazine a month later. Full-page photo of Jason, jaw squared, arms folded. Atlas logo glowing behind him. The headline read, "The Young CEO Who Rescued His Father's Legacy." I read the article twice. Not once was my name mentioned. Not as part of the executive team. Not as strategic advisor. Not even in passing. When I brought it up to Jason, he said, "You know how these things go. Reporters simplify. It's about the brand." But what he meant was, your work is valuable, but your name is inconvenient. After the funeral, the board held a private meeting. I wasn't invited. I found out about the leadership restructure from an email sent to all staff. Jason promoted himself to CEO. The board approved unanimously. My title didn't change. My role didn't change. But my presence became even more invisible. Decisions were made in rooms I wasn't in. Meetings were scheduled without me. And the worst part? No one questioned it. The few who remembered how close Atlas came to collapse, those who watched me carry it back to life, offered soft apologies. "It's political," they said. "You know how these things go." I knew. It was the same game, just on a bigger board. I stopped offering suggestions in meetings. I stopped fixing Jason's mistakes before they spiraled. I watched him stumble through strategy decks I used to write, contradict himself in earnings calls I used to script. He was trying to play the role he'd always been given, but even he knew he hadn't earned it. I worked quietly as always, built side partnerships, networked beyond the Atlas circle, took meetings under my own name, no more ghostwriting proposals or presenting under someone else's banner. Every connection I made from that point forward was mine. There were moments I wanted to scream, not because I needed praise, but because I wanted the truth to matter. I had carried that company through its darkest hour. I had walked into boardrooms full of doubt and walked out with belief. I had saved Jason's name from being synonymous with failure. And yet I remained an unnamed footnote. But I didn't explode. I didn't confront the board or walk out in protest. That would have made it about emotion, not power. Instead, I waited. Because power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the person who knows when to stay quiet and when to strike. And I already knew when that moment would come. It started with a photo. Jason's face, smiling next to a woman I had only seen once before, plastered across the homepage of every financial media site that morning. The headline read, "Atlas CEO announces engagement to Fairchild heiress." It didn't take long for me to piece it together. Her name was Charlotte Fairchild. Her father, Warren Fairchild, was a heavyweight investor known for sweeping in with capital when companies needed salvation, always with conditions that favored his legacy first. Atlas was bleeding again, and suddenly Jason was marrying a solution. Jason never mentioned Charlotte before, not in meetings, not in passing. Suddenly she was his fiancée, and their wedding was front-page news. The article claimed it was a whirlwind romance, two brilliant minds drawn together by fate. But I knew Jason better than anyone. He didn't believe in fate. He believed in leverage. Atlas had been struggling again. Quietly. The numbers were starting to show cracks: overextended credit lines, delayed payments, overly optimistic projections. I had flagged them. No one listened. The board buried the concerns. Jason pretended they didn't exist. Until suddenly, a solution emerged wrapped in white satin and diamonds. At first, I stayed silent. If he wanted to marry into money, that was his choice. But then I received a call from one of our longtime legal advisors, someone who owed me a favor. He had been asked to draft a clause in a merger proposal tied to a potential $30 million investment from the Fairchild Group. The clause stipulated that Atlas's future strategic growth plan had to be signed off by both the CEO and its governing co-founder, a role unnamed in the media but listed clearly in the back end of the draft. My name. The Fairchilds weren't stupid. They had done their homework. They knew who had kept Atlas alive. They didn't want Jason making decisions alone. They wanted my hand on the pen before they moved forward. That's when the puzzle locked into place. The engagement wasn't a love story. It was a contract negotiation. Jason hadn't fallen for Charlotte. He had fallen for her father's capital. And me, the invisible sister, the fallback, the fixer, I was the final term of that deal. They didn't even bother to tell me directly. I found out through paperwork. I wasn't invited to any investor meetings. I wasn't looped into negotiations. No voice, no seat, just a signature. I was expected to show up, smile for the cameras, and quietly approve the next chapter of the company I helped build, but was never allowed to lead. I was summoned to a pre-wedding dinner under the guise of family unity. The table was long, ornate, and lined with strangers in suits, pretending to be celebratory. Jason introduced me to Charlotte as Olivia, my sister. She keeps things running in the background. Her handshake was soft, her smile polished, but her eyes were calculating. Warren Fairchild sat at the head of the table, speaking little, watching everything. When the toasts were over, he approached me with the ease of someone used to control. He didn't ask me how I felt about the engagement. He didn't ask how I saw my role in the company. He said, "We're counting on your cooperation to make this partnership seamless." It wasn't a question. It was a warning. I nodded, but inside something cracked open. Not rage, not yet. It was deeper than that. It was the weight of being used by people who wore your blood like armor while stabbing from behind. I had forgiven oversight. I had swallowed omission. But this was design. This was calculated. They were building a future on my signature, my silence, my surrender. Jason cornered me before I left the room. "Don't make this difficult," he said. "It's just a formality. We need this deal." I looked at him, really looked. The same boy who once crashed his bike and begged me not to tell Dad. The same man who let me save Atlas without saying thank you. His suit fit better now, his hair grayer, but inside he hadn't changed. He was still using everyone around him as pawns and assuming I would play along. I didn't answer him that night. I walked out, heels tapping on marble, head held high. But I already knew what I would do. Not for him, not for Charlotte, not for Fairchild. For me. The morning of the signing, I woke up earlier than usual. The sky was still gray, the air too still. It felt like the kind of day that wanted to hold its breath. I moved through my routine with deliberate calm, even though every step was weighed down by the invisible tension that had followed me for weeks. On the surface, everything had been arranged. The legal team had sent over the final documents. The board had already voted in anticipation. My signature was the last step. After that, the Fairchild deal would close and Atlas would be safe. That was the word they used, safe. I wasn't sure who they meant by we. I sat at my desk in the study, coffee cooling beside me, pen in hand. The papers were spread out neatly. A nameplate with my initials sat to the left, a reminder of the role I never officially held but had always fulfilled. I stared at the first page, trying to convince myself that this was just another transaction. Just ink and paper. Not personal. Not betrayal. Just business. That's when it happened. A soft ping from my email inbox. I almost ignored it. The subject line looked like a scheduling reminder, FW signature confirmation request, and I assumed it was from one of the assistants coordinating the signing logistics. But then I saw the email thread below. A line of text that stopped me mid-breath. It was an internal forward. Charlotte had accidentally copied me into a message she meant to send only to Jason. It read, "Once she signs, we're done babysitting her. She'll be irrelevant." I read it again, slower this time, as if the words would morph into something less cruel. But they didn't. They stayed sharp and smug and surgical. The kind of thing people say when they believe you're nothing but a means to their end. I didn't know what stung more, the condescension or the confidence with which it had been delivered. No hesitation, no nuance, just a plan laid bare. The room was quiet, but I felt everything shift. My fingers went cold. My vision tunneled. A hollow breath escaped me. For a moment, I actually felt my body begin to shake. My chest tightened, eyes stung. I hadn't expected gratitude, but I also hadn't expected cruelty. I had spent so many years convincing myself that being used was better than being discarded. But now I saw the truth. They had always planned to discard me. This was never about partnership. It was about pacification. I was a checkbox, a silent name they needed for 30 seconds. After that, I would disappear. But then something happened. The shake in my hands stilled, my spine straightened, and I laughed. Quietly, but not softly. It wasn't humor. It was recognition. The kind of laugh that comes when the mask finally drops and the play ends. When you realize they think they've won and they haven't even seen the real game. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the contract like it was written in another language. It might as well have been. This wasn't my legacy. This was theirs. Built on deceit, tied with satin, paraded in public as brilliance. And I had been invited only to sign it all away and vanish. Charlotte, with her flawless smile and curated charm, had revealed herself completely in one sentence. And Jason, he had known. Whether he replied or not, whether he agreed out loud or only nodded silently, I didn't need to see it. The betrayal was mutual. I was never part of their future. I was just a temporary necessity. I closed the folder. No rush. I forwarded the email to my private legal advisor with one note: hold everything. Then I stood, smoothed my blazer, and walked out of the room. The pen lay untouched on the desk. The contract sat unsigned. Somewhere across the city, Jason was likely refreshing his inbox, waiting for confirmation, assuming that, as always, I would deliver. That I would do what needed to be done for the good of the family, the company, the illusion. But I had no intention of signing away power to people who saw me as a burden to tolerate. Not now. Not ever again. They thought they'd baited me into compliance. Instead, they had handed me the match and pointed me to the fuse. The day I refused to sign, the weather looked ordinary, the kind that makes people think the world will go on exactly as planned. I closed the folder, sent one short note to my attorney, and stepped away from the desk with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. Let them think I was wavering. Let them tell themselves I would come around by lunch. I had already outgrown the room they were trying to lock me in. Long before the Fairchild engagement and the polite threats wrapped in crystal toasts, I had been building something of my own, out of sight, out of reach, and out of their imagination. It didn't start with a grand design. It began with small, careful bets, placed where no one else wanted to look. A Delaware LLC with an innocuous name. A trust administered by a lawyer who never took photos at industry events. A handful of friends I trusted to put their names on the paperwork when mine would have raised questions. When you spend a lifetime being unseen, you learn how to use that invisibility. I turned it into a method. The first founders I backed met me at a diner near the train station because they couldn't afford the parking garage by the office tower. Maya and Luis had a product that looked boring to everyone except the bank CTOs who stayed up nights worrying about core switches and fraud velocity. They'd been turned down by every fund within 100 miles. I listened, asked them to walk me through their worst-case scenarios twice, and wrote a check through Harbor 12 Holdings, a quiet entity that never showed up on glossy lists. 18 months later, their software was humming behind 3 mid-sized banks, and for the first time they paid themselves real salaries. When they called to celebrate, they didn't thank an institution. They thanked me by my first name. After that came Ruth, who bought derelict warehouses no one wanted, and turned them into mixed-use buildings with clinics on the first floor and apprenticeships upstairs. Then Ahmed, who built a payment rail for tradespeople that settled funds by sundown and stopped men from quitting because a Friday check slipped to Monday. Then Alondra, who designed a micro-lending model that didn't bury single mothers in fees when a tire blew on the way to work. None of them fit the slides you see on conference stages. All of them knew the families who live one invoice or one illness away from falling through a crack no one bothered to repair. I didn't ask for a seat on their stages. I asked for clean documents, voting rights if things went sideways, and covenants that protected workers from the kind of corner cutting that turns profit into rot. I took observer spots when it helped and stepped out of camera frames when it didn't. Press releases never mentioned me. They didn't need to. Term sheets did. It wasn't a single tower, it was a lattice. Quiet strands reaching across industries that never learned each other's names. A fintech node here, a logistics stub there, a property hold in a neighborhood papered with eviction notices I refused to sign. Each line strengthened the next. Returns rolled back into new bets. The founders ate better. Their teams grew. Payroll cleared on time. And every quarter I updated a spreadsheet, only I saw not because I needed a scoreboard, but because discipline is what keeps power from curdling into appetite. Back at Atlas, people mistook my calm for dependence. They told themselves I stayed because I had nowhere else to go because I was grateful to be allowed adjacent to the grown-up table. They believed silence meant I had accepted my role. They did not understand that I had been practicing patience, and patience is not the same thing as surrender. When Jason floated his digital expansion memo, I read it twice, then a third time. The vendors he circled as linchpins, NectraPay for instant disbursements, Northline Core for bank integrations, a compliance shop that had finally figured out how to automate diligence without dehumanizing clients were precisely the firms my capital had steadied when no one else would. He thought he'd discovered them through his new in-laws network. He didn't know that the CEOs still texted me before they signed anything meaningful. One afternoon, as the engagement buzz filled our inboxes, my phone buzzed with a name I didn't save under its real spelling. Olivia Atlas asked for exclusivity on Northline for 12 months. The founder said voice lowered the way people do when they're about to admit something they shouldn't. It would crowd out a community bank we've been helping in the valley. We wanted to check with you before we answer. I could hear the hum of their tiny office behind him, a printer choking on labels, someone laughing about a broken chair. I told him to put the community bank first, and if Atlas wanted speed to offer fair terms without swallowing the rest of the market. He agreed. It wasn't about kneecapping anyone. It was about reminding a company I once loved that access is not the same as entitlement. I didn't need to raise my voice to be heard. The contracts did that for me. Quietly, the web tightened. A logistics startup I had shepherded through a brutal winter controlled a lane Jason needed for a splashy pilot. A data vendor Charlotte's friends whispered about at luncheons used a fraud model I had funded when it was a whiteboard sketch. A property Atlas planned to lease for its new hub sat inside a portfolio that answered to a manager who returned my calls on Sundays. None of this made me a puppet master. It made me the adult in a room full of people who had forgotten that growth requires roots. My roots ran deeper than they realized. People assumed I wanted Atlas because I had bled for it. That was an old story told by people who confuse endurance with possession. I wanted Atlas to be decent. Failing that, I wanted distance. And beyond that, I wanted enough leverage to refuse what harmed the people who built the balance sheets everyone liked to admire from a stage. So I stayed small in public and precise in private. I asked boring questions. I read appendices. I left early. I paid on time. I kept my promises even when no one was watching, especially then. On the morning I declined to sign, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt ready. Ready in the way a field feels after the frost has done its work, and the soil is dark and clean, holding more than it shows. If Jason called a vendor I had nurtured, they would take the call. They would also call me. If Charlotte tried to flex leverage she hadn't earned, she would learn the difference between proximity and stewardship. And if Atlas wanted to build something honest, I would never be the one to stand in the way. But if they wanted to buy my silence with a ring and a headline, they had misread the only asset in the room that wasn't for sale. They used to say I was a ghost behind the curtain haunting their empire. It amused me in a way. I was behind the curtain, yes, but I wasn't lingering. I was sewing, and the drawstring ran straight through my hands. The night before the wedding, the family gathered at a restaurant that had once been our father's favorite. It was supposed to be warm, celebratory, and intimate dinner to honor what was coming. At least that was the story told to the guests who sat beneath chandeliers raising glasses of wine and clinking forks against porcelain. But I could feel it the moment I walked in. The smiles were too wide, the laughter too rehearsed, and the words chosen too carefully. The whole thing was theater, a performance staged to show the Fairchilds that our family stood united. Except unity had never lived here. My mother greeted me with a half-embrace that ended before it began. Her perfume was sharp, familiar, and suffocating. She sat across from me at the long table, her pearls catching the candlelight. When the chatter dipped for a moment, she leaned forward just enough so only I could hear her. Con kung kamat la tot roy, dung lam roy tame. Her tone wasn't scolding, not outright. It was worse. It was dismissive, as if my presence itself was a disruption, something to be tolerated rather than welcomed. I didn't respond. I reached for my water glass, lifted it to my lips, and let the silence stand. If she wanted me small, voiceless, erased, then silence would be my armor. Jason arrived late, as he always did when he wanted to make an entrance. He carried Charlotte's hand like a trophy, guiding her into the room with a proud tilt of his chin. The table erupted in approval, as if his presence alone was enough to bless the evening. He sat directly beside our mother Charlotte on his right and began recounting stories of his journey as if we hadn't all lived it too. He spoke of sacrifices, of perseverance, of building Atlas brick by brick. Every sentence was designed for Warren Fairchild's ears, every detail polished to shine like truth. When he finally acknowledged me, it was with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Chi nen beat vi triquamin," he said smoothly, though the words sliced all the same. He said it like advice, but it was a warning. Stay quiet. Stay invisible. Sign what you're told to sign, and don't interfere with the show. The table chuckled politely, as if his jab were nothing more than sibling banter. But I saw the glances, a flicker of agreement in my mother's eyes, a dismissive curl at the corner of Charlotte's lips. Warren said nothing, but his silence carried weight. He didn't care about family politics. He cared about signatures, about control. If Jason could keep me in line, Warren would let him play the part of the golden son. I cut into my meal and chewed slowly, deliberately. I didn't argue. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Outwardly, I played the role they wrote for me, the quiet sister at the far end of the table, tolerated for the sake of appearances. But inside, the decision had already solidified into stone. I remembered the email, the single line Charlotte had sent in arrogance, not knowing her mask had slipped. Once she signs we're done babysitting her, she'll be irrelevant. The words replayed in my head as Jason toasted to the bright future of Atlas, and my mother dabbed her lips with a linen napkin. None of them knew that the bright future they celebrated was already slipping from their grasp. My silence was not surrender. It was calculation. Every insult laid across that dinner table was another reminder of why I could never let them succeed at chaining me into irrelevance. I had spent years building a lattice of companies, founders, and partners who trusted me when no one else did. Jason thought he had maneuvered me into a corner, but he had walked into a room where every exit was mine. The dinner dragged on, filled with shallow toasts, and the kind of laughter that echoes hollow once it fades. I nodded when appropriate, smiled when required, and said little more than pleasantries. Let them think I was cowed. Let them believe their performance worked. They would remember this night as the last time they mistook my silence for weakness. As dessert was served, Jason raised his glass once more. To family, he declared. Glasses clinked all around me. I raised mine too, though my thoughts were elsewhere. To family, yes. But not the kind seated at this table. Not the kind who used blood as leverage and kinship as chains. My loyalty belonged elsewhere now, to those who had trusted me, to the empire I had built in the shadows, to the version of myself they had tried to erase, but had only sharpened. I left the dinner with my head high and my lips sealed. They thought they had won the evening, that my silence was submission. But the decision was already made. The stage was set. Tomorrow they would see just how mistaken they were. The wedding day dawned bright, the kind of morning that photographers pray for all clean skies and golden light. The Fairchild estate had been transformed into something out of a magazine spread, rows of orchids lining the walkway, violins filling the air with delicate strains of Mozart, waiters gliding between tables dressed in white linens. It was the kind of event designed to impress, to whisper of power, money, and permanence. From the outside, it looked perfect. From the inside, I knew better. I arrived on time, not early, not late. Enough to be noticed, but not enough to invite conversation. The ushers at the entrance glanced at my invitation, exchanged a look I knew too well, and gestured vaguely toward the back. My name wasn't on the place cards that lined the elegant tables with calligraphy scripts. My seat, they told me, was being arranged. When I finally found it, I almost laughed. Almost. A small table tucked near the swinging doors of the kitchen, away from the chandeliers and the main floor where the family and honored guests sat. My chair wobbled on the uneven floor, pushed so close to the service station that I could hear the chefs shouting orders and smell the steam rising from trays. There was no name card, no linen napkin folded like a swan, just a plain chair set apart from the rest, as though I were one of the hired staff waiting for my shift to begin. I took my seat. Slowly, deliberately. If they expected me to protest, they would be disappointed. My silence was louder than any outburst. Charlotte, radiant in lace and jewels, glided past at that moment. Her timing was intentional. She paused, ensuring her voice carried far enough for the nearby tables to hear. "She doesn't run anything. Let her eat with the staff." The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. For a moment, the music seemed to falter, or maybe it was just my ears filling with the rush of blood. I looked around the room. My mother lowered her gaze, her lips pressed thin. Jason sipped his champagne without meeting my eyes. A few of the cousins smirked into their napkins. The laughter came next, quiet at first, then growing rippling through the tables like a cruel tide. Not one person stood. Not one voice said enough. That was the knife. Not Charlotte's cruelty, she was predictable, but the silence of the people who should have known better. The silence of family, of blood, of those who had taken my sacrifices as their inheritance. That silence cut deeper than any insult ever could. I folded my hands in my lap and stared at the untouched glass of water in front of me. Every clink of silverware, every burst of laughter, every whisper of gossip fueled a storm inside me that never touched my face. Outwardly, I was still. Inwardly, I was engraving each moment into memory. I wanted to remember how it felt to be erased in plain sight, because it would make what came next burn brighter. The staff passed by me again and again, trays balanced high, apologetic glances darted my way when they thought no one was looking. Even they understood what this seat meant. It wasn't oversight. It wasn't an accident. It was punishment dressed as dismissal. It was their way of saying I was no one, that the empire would march forward without me, that my years of labor meant less than the linen folded on the tables up front. Jason raised his glass for a toast, his voice booming with confidence. He thanked the Fairchilds, he thanked Charlotte, he thanked the guests for believing in his vision for Atlas. He didn't thank me. He didn't even acknowledge me. To the room, I wasn't there. But I was. And I was watching. I smiled then, a small controlled curve of my lips that no one noticed. Let them laugh, let them whisper, let them believe they had cornered me into submission. What they didn't know, what they could never imagine, was that the woman they tried to bury had been planting seeds for years. As the laughter died down and the music swelled again, I sat at my kitchen-side table, back straight, head high, letting the weight of their silence press down one last time. It was the final insult, the last act of humiliation. And it was all I needed. Because silence cuts both ways. Theirs had wounded. Mine would destroy. The laughter at my expense was still rippling through the tables when I reached into my clutch. My hand was steady, my pulse calm. Let them think I was cowed. Let them believe their silence had broken me. The truth was far simpler. Their silence had freed me. I slipped the phone into my palm, its weight reassuring, the kind of weight that carried consequences. Around me, champagne glasses glittered and violins swelled. The bride preened at the head table. Jason basked in his moment. No one noticed as I pressed a single contact. Cancel the contract. 3 words, spoken low, spoken clear. The kind of words that don't need to be shouted to be final. On the other end, the head of investments didn't hesitate. He knew my voice. He knew the authority it carried. Understood, he said. And then I added, "We're not merging with Atlas. Draft the deal under my holding company. Atlas is dead." I ended the call before the applause around me had even faded. For a moment, nothing seemed to change. The waiters still carried trays, the guests still laughed, the chandeliers still glittered. But then I saw it, the ripple. First in Jason's face. He had turned toward me, maybe to deliver another cruel line, maybe to gloat. But his smirk froze. Color drained from his cheeks as his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, then again and again as message after message lit up in rapid succession. Charlotte leaned toward him, whispering sharp questions. He didn't answer. His hand gripped the glass stem so tightly I thought it might shatter. My mother frowned, sensing the shift but not yet understanding it. And then it happened. Warren Fairchild's chair scraped back across the polished floor. The sound cut through the music like a blade. He rose without ceremony, his jaw set, his eyes locked on Jason with cold fury. A murmur spread across the room as the billionaire investor adjusted his cufflinks and signaled for his driver. "I don't do business with amateurs," he said flatly. "No toast, no congratulations, just condemnation." Then he turned and walked out, his entourage following like a shadow. The silence that followed was heavier than any insult I'd endured. Guests shifted in their seats. Some whispered, some stared, all of them sensing that something enormous had just cracked open in the middle of the celebration. Jason stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. He was pale, trembling, his lips forming words he couldn't manage to speak. "What did you do?" He finally spat, his voice too loud, too desperate. I lifted my glass of water, calm, unhurried, and looked at him across the room. I just reminded them who really built the empire. My words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. Everyone heard them. Charlotte's smile collapsed, her perfect facade crumbling in front of her guests. My mother's pearls trembled against her collarbone as her breathing quickened. Cousins avoided my eyes. And Jason, once so smug, so untouchable, looked like a boy watching his castle burn. Because that's what was happening. The foundation they had stood on for so long was already crumbling. In one call, one decision, the $30 million deal they had staked their future on had vanished into smoke. The empire they claimed as theirs was slipping from their fingers, not in a courtroom, not in a boardroom, but in front of everyone who mattered. I set my glass down and stood, not hurried, not flustered. I didn't raise my voice, didn't plead, didn't explain. I simply left my seat by the kitchen and walked past the rows of stunned faces. Let them watch. Let them wonder. Let them realize that the sister they had dismissed, belittled, erased, had just ended them with 3 words. As I reached the doors, I paused. Not for effect, just long enough for the truth to sink in. Jason had always believed he could bury me in silence. Tonight, I buried him with it. And when I stepped outside into the night air, the sounds of the chaos behind me spilling out into the courtyard, I felt lighter than I had in years. Atlas was dead. And I had killed it. The wedding ended in whispers and broken glass. By morning, those whispers had become headlines. Fairchild Capital withdrew its commitment before the champagne had gone flat. Reporters smelled blood. By dawn, the story was everywhere. Jason Fairchild's grand merger evaporated in public, the bride's family humiliated, Atlas exposed as fragile. Markets are merciless. When the opening bell rang, Atlas stock nosedived. Not a slow drip, a free fall. 20% gone before lunch, another 15% by closing. Phones that once rang with congratulations now stayed eerily silent. Emails came in, but they weren't contracts or offers. They were terminations. Investors pulling out. Partners suspending deals. Suppliers demanding guarantees Jason couldn't give. He scrambled. He called for an emergency board meeting. He demanded loyalty, pleaded for patience. But directors stopped answering. One excused herself with a prior engagement. Another claimed his connection was bad and never rejoined the line. Jason sat at the head of a boardroom designed for triumph, staring at a screen of blank squares, talking to no one. The press feasted. Photos of Jason at the altar, smiling like a king, ran beside stock tickers plunging red. Anchors called it the fastest unraveling of a mid-tier empire in recent memory. Pundits speculated about hidden fractures, mismanagement, betrayal. Words he had once used to describe me now clung to him. My phone rang that evening. Mother. Her voice carried the kind of panic I had only heard once before the day Father died. Olivia, she whispered, breathless. Why? Why would you do this to your own family? I listened. I let her gasp, let her stumble over words that tasted of desperation. Then I answered, slow and sharp enough to cut. Because you let me sit by the kitchen. The silence on the line was exquisite. Not confusion. Recognition. She knew exactly what I meant. Every dismissal, every stolen credit, every time I was pushed aside until there was nowhere left but a chair by the swinging doors. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. For once in her life, my mother was speechless. Jason tried again the next day. He held a press conference, sweat beading under the studio lights. He spoke of resilience, of temporary setbacks, of loyalty. But behind him, screens flashed with real-time data, Atlas collapsing in plain sight. Reporters shouted questions about canceled deals, about leadership failures, about betrayals inside his own family. His voice cracked. His hands trembled. Cameras caught everything. By the end of the week, the empire he had paraded as unshakable was gone. Investors abandoned ship. Directors resigned. Lawsuits loomed. And the world that had once applauded Jason Fairchild now pointed and laughed the way they had laughed at me when Charlotte sentenced me to the kitchen. The difference was, I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to explain. I had spoken 3 words, and they had done the work for me. The city at night was a living thing, glittering with lights and restless motion. From the corner office of my tower, I could see everything, bridges glowing in the distance, traffic flowing like veins through the streets, and just below the courtyard of a luxury hotel where another wedding was unfolding. Strings of fairy lights wound around columns, champagne glasses shimmered in guests' hands, and laughter floated upward on the wind. I watched for a long moment. Weddings had become symbolic to me, not for love or beginnings, but for masks. For performances, for the theater of families trying to sell perfection while hiding rot. I thought of that night not long ago when I'd been sent to the kitchen table. The sting of the words, the laughter that followed, the silence of the people who should have defended me. I closed my eyes and let myself relive it for one final time. The wobbling chair, the swinging kitchen doors, the heat of humiliation pressing against my skin while violins played in another room. It could have broken me. For a moment it almost did. But the truth was that seat was the final gift they ever gave me. It reminded me exactly who I was not. A knock on the door pulled me from the memory. One of my young executives stepped in holding a file, then hesitated when he saw me by the glass. He glanced toward the window at the wedding far below, and then back at me. His voice was careful, uncertain. Do you ever think about reconciling with them? With your family? I turned from the window and studied him. He was earnest, too young to understand the weight of betrayal, too hopeful to know how corrosive silence could be. For him, family was still a place of safety. For me, it had been a cage. I let the question hang between us, filling the office with its gravity. Then I answered, steady and deliberate. I wasn't meant to sit in the kitchen. I was meant to own the building. The words landed like stone. His eyes widened, and then he nodded slowly as if he had just been handed a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. I turned back to the window, the wedding below a blur of light and music. Somewhere out there, Jason was still clawing at the ruins, still telling anyone who would listen that he could rise again. My mother was still rehearsing excuses for the press. Charlotte was still trying to salvage her reputation. None of them mattered now. Their empire had collapsed, and mine had risen not on their approval, not on their acceptance, but on the strength they never believed I had. Power, I had learned, isn't in the seat you're given. It's in the building you choose to walk out of and the one you choose to build. They had taught me that by trying to erase me. Now I lived it every day. Behind me, the office buzzed with energy phones ringing, deals, closing, futures being written. The Olivia Group wasn't just surviving, it was defining the next era. And I stood at the center not as someone tolerated in the corner of a banquet hall, but as the architect of the whole skyline. I lifted my glass, not of champagne, but of water, cool and clear. A toast, not to them, not to vengeance, but to clarity. I had been invisible once. Never again. Because I didn't belong in the kitchen. I belonged here. And the building was mine. And so Olivia's journey comes to a close, from a wobbly chair beside the kitchen to a corner office in the tallest tower where the whole city looks up. This story isn't just about revenge. It's about knowing your worth, rising from silence, and turning it into power. Her family's silence destroyed everything they thought they owned. Olivia proved that sometimes victory doesn't come from shouting to be heard, but from waiting for the right moment to speak 3 words that can bring an empire to its knees. If you've ever been dismissed, pushed aside, or told you don't belong at the table, remember this: the shadows can be where you build your empire. Olivia didn't beg, she didn't steal, she didn't cling. She simply walked away and left those who scorned her to burn in the ashes of their own arrogance. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Olivia was too ruthless, or was she simply reclaiming what had always been hers? Have you ever been sidelined and wished you could come back stronger? Share your thoughts in the comments, because this isn't just Olivia's story. It belongs to everyone who's ever been underestimated. If you want more stories filled with drama, revenge, and justice served cold, make sure you subscribe to this channel. Each story brings a lesson, a moment of satisfaction, and maybe even the inspiration to rise stronger than ever. You followed Olivia from the kitchen table to the skyscraper, but there are countless more stories to come. Don't miss them. Hit subscribe and be the first to watch as truth is revealed and villains finally face their reckoning.